The signal came in wrong. Commander Odessa Kale noticed it first because she was the only officer on the bridge of the 10 Gallowmark who still watched raw telemetry feeds instead of the filtered summaries. Everyone else trusted the clean columns of green text that said all 14 agricultural colonies in the vast expanse were transmitting normally. Harvest reports filed on schedule. Atmospheric monitors within tolerance. Population registers updating at the expected intervals. The filtered feed was a lullaby, and most bridge officers let it sing them through the graveyard shift without a second glance. But the raw feed told a different story. Colony 7's atmospheric composition had shifted 3 standard deviations in 40 seconds. No storm did that. No equipment failure produced a chemical spike like the one crawling across Kale's secondary display. A jagged red line climbing through concentrations that should have been impossible outside a weapons laboratory. She pulled Colony 7's feed to her primary screen and leaned forward. Methylfluoride concentrations were climbing at a rate that made her stomach clench. She had seen those compounds before, years ago, in a classified briefing about denidaria denial agents, nerve toxins that bonded to soil, to water, to lung tissue. The kind of persistent chemical weapon that turned farmland into a graveyard for 1,000 years and made the very ground toxic to anything with a central nervous system. "Get me a direct link to Colony 7, she said. Lieutenant Harsk looked up from navigation. "Routine traffic's clean, Commander. They filed a harvest report at 2:14. "Get me a direct link, voice, now." He tried. The link connected. Nobody answered. The silence on the open channel had a particular quality to it, not static, not interference, but a flatness that told Kale the microphones were still live and the air processors were still humming and the colony's communication array was still drawing power. Everything was working. The only thing missing was human voices. She pulled Colony 9, same atmospheric shift, same silence. Colony 3, same. Colony 12. The same red line climbing the same impossible curve. She went down the list with a cold efficiency that felt mechanical even to her, and by the time she reached Colony 14, the pattern was unmistakable. All 14 agricultural stations in the vast expanse were showing the same toxic cascade, the same communication silence, the same dead air on open channels. 14 colonies, over 300,000 civilians, farmers mostly, agronomists, teachers running one-room schoolhouses for children who had grown up knowing nothing but wheat fields under a lavender sky, medical staff, mechanics who kept the harvesters running, administrative personnel who filed harvest reports at 2:14 because that was when the grain tallies were finalized. 300,000 people whose daily routines were so predictable that their automated systems could mimic normality, even after every person in every colony had stopped breathing. "Signal CENTCOM," Kale said. Her voice did not shake. It would not shake. "Classification Crimson. 14 colonies in the vast expanse are under simultaneous chemical attack. Agent appears to be a persistent nerve compound delivered via atmospheric dispersal. No survivors are transmitting." Harsk stared at her. "All 14. All 14, do it now." The signal went out at 2:47. Kale stood at the center of the bridge and listened to the silence pouring in from 14 open channels while she waited for confirmation. The silence had weight. It pressed against the bridge like something physical, and the bridge crew felt it. Weapons Officer Lieutenant Commander Vesson stopped her routine diagnostic cycle and stared at her console without moving. Signals Officer Petty Officer Tanaka had both hands flat on his desk. Harsk kept refreshing the Colony 7 channel, not because he expected an answer, but because stopping felt like giving up. By 2:51, Kale had confirmation from 3 separate sensor platforms. The chemical signatures were not natural, not accidental, and not human in origin. The molecular structure of the agent matched nothing in Earth's inventory. It was alien. Specifically, it matched a class of atmospheric weapons that Terran intelligence had cataloged, but never seen deployed weapons attributed to the Valith Concordance. The Valith were old, older than Earth's spacefaring history by a factor of 30. They administered a loose federation of 11 species across a volume of space that dwarfed human holdings, and they had regarded humanity's expansion into the vast expanse with the particular blend of irritation and contempt that a landowner feels toward weeds growing in an unused field. There had been diplomatic notes, formal objections filed through 6 different interstellar arbitration bodies. A resolution in the Valith High Chamber declaring the vast expanse a protected cultural heritage zone, despite the fact that no Valith had set foot there in 6 centuries, and the archaeological surveys they cited referred to ruins that had been old when humanity first split the atom. Earth's diplomatic corps had responded with legal arguments, with historical surveys showing the colonies predated the Valith claim by decades, with offers of shared governance and cultural preservation agreements. The Valith diplomatic liaison had received each proposal with an expression that the human ambassador later described in a classified memo as the face a customs officer makes when an insect lands on the paperwork. The Valith had responded with nerve gas. At 2:53, the Gallowmark signals officer intercepted a Valith military transmission on a frequency the Concordance did not know Earth could read. Kale watched Tanaka's face as he decoded it, watched the blood drain from his cheeks in real time. He transferred the text to her display without a word. The message was brief, administrative, almost bored in its tone. A status report from a Valith flotilla commander to the High Chamber, confirming that atmospheric denial operations across the vast agricultural zone had been completed on schedule and within projected casualty parameters. The flotilla commander noted that dispersal had been achieved in 9 hours across all 14 targets, that preliminary atmospheric readings indicated full saturation of the denial agent, and that no organized resistance or evacuation attempts had been detected. The phrase the commander used for the 300,000 dead was surface clearance verification positive. The message ended with a request for updated patrol assignments and a note about a maintenance issue with one of the dispersal craft's ventilation filters. The maintenance note was the part that stayed with Kale. The commander who had just reported the extermination of 300,000 human beings was filing a work order about an air filter in the same transmission. That was how small it was to them. She read the intercept twice. The second time, she read it aloud to her bridge crew. She wanted them to hear the words, surface clearance verification positive. She wanted every person on the Gallowmark's bridge to understand what had been done and who had done it and how little it had cost the people who did it. Then she sent the intercept to CENTCOM with her own annotation. The Valith did not consider this an act of war. They considered it pest control. CENTCOM's response arrived at 3:04, 17 minutes after Kale's initial report. In those 17 minutes, someone at Earth Central Command had read her report, verified the telemetry, confirmed the Valith origin of the agent, briefed the chain of command up to the commander-in-chief, received authorization, and transmitted the activation code. 17 minutes for a decision that would end a civilization's military existence. The response was not a question. It was not a request for clarification. It was not a diplomatic initiative. It was 2 words and a numerical code. Iron Meridian. Kale had heard the name in strategic briefings, spoken the way people speak about things they hope will never be needed, the way engineers speak about a building's seismic tolerance or doctors speak about a patient's living will. Iron Meridian was not a battle plan. It was the answer, the total, final, irrevocable answer that Earth had designed for one specific scenario, a mass atrocity against civilian populations by a state actor that did not recognize it as an atrocity. The doctrine was blunt in its simplicity. Overwhelming force applied with absolute precision to every military, logistical, and governmental node of the offending power. Simultaneously, with no pause for negotiation, no ceasefire window, no opportunity for the offender to reframe or apologize or offer terms. Iron Meridian did not begin with a warning because the atrocity was the warning. The doctrine existed because Earth's strategic planners had understood, decades before the vast expanse was colonized, that some acts are so complete in their contempt for human life that the only proportionate response is the elimination of the capacity to repeat them. Iron Meridian activated at 3:04. By 3:06, 8,400 warships had received their targeting packages. The ships were already positioned. That was the part the Valith would later fail to understand, when there was still a Valith leadership structure capable of failing to understand anything. The Iron Meridian fleet was not assembled in response to the attack. It had been prepositioned for years, scattered across 27 staging areas in deep space, engines cold, crews rotating through readiness drills that felt theoretical until the moment they were not. The ships did not need to be gathered. They needed to be pointed. Commander Kale received her own targeting package at 3:08. The Gallomark was assigned to Strike Group Hale, one of 42 strike groups converging on the Valith home system of Ashkarath. Her group contained 200 warships. Ashkarath had a defense fleet of perhaps 600. The other 41 strike groups would hit Valith military installations across the entire concordance simultaneously: shipyards, ammunition manufacturing stations, fuel depots, sensor networks, training facilities, dry docks. Everything that allowed the Valith to build, maintain, supply, and deploy a military force. She looked at the numbers. 8,400 human warships against a civilization that had just gassed 14 farming colonies because it found the farmers inconvenient. The disproportion was not an accident. It was the message. "All hands," Kale said into the shipwide channel. "This is the commander. At 2:47 this morning, the Valith Concordance deployed persistent nerve agents against all 14 human agricultural colonies in the vast expanse. Over 300,000 civilians are presumed dead. There are no confirmed survivors. CENTCOM has activated Iron Meridian. We are Strike Group Hale. Our objective is Ashkarath. Transit time is 11 hours. Battle stations at hour 10. That is all." She did not add commentary. She did not tell them how to feel. They were professionals, and what had been done to 300,000 farmers did not require interpretation. The Gallomark jumped to transit at 3:12. The ship hummed with a frequency Kale had never heard before, a resonance in the hull plating that seemed to come from the engines running at a sustained output they had never been asked to sustain outside of a drill. Around her, the bridge crew worked in near silence. Harsk plotted the transit corridor with a precision that bordered on compulsive, verifying each waypoint 3 times. Vesson ran diagnostics on every forward battery and reported each one ready with a clipped formality that concealed nothing. Tanaka monitored the Valith communications spectrum continuously, feeding updates to Kale's display. Below the bridge, the Gallomark's crew of 640 moved through their stations with the focused quiet of people who have been told something terrible and are converting it into action. Kale monitored the internal status feeds. The armory reported all marine detachments equipped and standing by. Engineering reported reactor output at 94% sustained, well within safety margins, but higher than any peacetime operation had ever demanded. Medical had prepped trauma bays and drawn up triage protocols, though if Iron Meridian worked as designed, they would not be needed. The ship's chaplain had requested access to the intercom for a brief address. Kale denied the request. This was not a moment for comfort. It was a moment for clarity. At 3:30, Tanaka flagged a new intercept. A second Valith transmission, this one from a different flotilla, a patrol group operating in a sector adjacent to the vast expanse. The patrol commander was requesting permission to conduct a follow-up survey of the Voss colonies to assess whether any subsurface infrastructure had survived the atmospheric denial. The request included a note suggesting that surviving underground structures might need to be addressed with subsurface penetrators to ensure complete remediation of the heritage zone. They were planning a second pass. The first wave of nerve gas had killed 300,000 people, and the Valith were already planning to make sure the tunnels and basements were dead too. Kale forwarded the intercept to CENTCOM. She did not add an annotation this time. The intercept spoke for itself. At hour 1, the first strike group check-in arrived. All 42 groups confirmed transit. 8,400 warships moving through controlled space toward 42 separate objectives, their courses calculated to the meter, their arrival times synchronized to within 90 seconds of each other. The coordination required to move that many ships simultaneously was something Earth's Navy had practiced for years in simulations the crews had called the drill we'll never need. Now they needed it, and the drill was flawless. Kale scrolled through the check-in roster. The names of the ships blurred past in columns of white text: dreadnoughts, battle cruisers, heavy destroyers, fleet carriers, electronic warfare platforms, logistics tenders. The Gallomark was a Resurgent-class dreadnought, one of the newest in the fleet, but the roster showed vessels of every generation, some of them older than Kale's career, their hulls refitted and upgraded through decades of maintenance cycles that had kept them ready for a day their crews had hoped would never come. The 10 Forge of Canberra was 42 years old and still reporting 100% combat readiness. The 10 Sulawesi had been laid down the year Kale was born. They were all moving. They were all on time. At hour 1 and 15 minutes, a priority communication arrived from CENTCOM addressed to all strike group commanders. The communication was a classified intelligence summary detailing the confirmed chemical agent used in the Voss attack. The compound was designated VX-Analog-7, a fourth-generation persistent nerve agent optimized for atmospheric dispersal over large surface areas. The summary noted that VX-Analog-7 had been specifically engineered to bind with organic carbon chains in soil, which meant the compound would integrate with agricultural land and remain active in the topsoil for an estimated 800 to 1,200 years. The Valith had not simply killed the colonists. They had killed the land. The grain fields that Dara Osai had spent years developing would be toxic for 40 generations. The summary also noted that VX-Analog-7 was classified in the Valith military inventory under the category remediation agents, not weapons, remediation agents, the same category that included herbicides and industrial solvents. At hour 2, Kale reviewed the intelligence package on Ashkarath. The Valith home system was heavily developed. 17 habitable stations orbited a gas giant, with the governmental seat on the largest moon, Ashkarath Prime. The defense fleet was anchored in a constellation of 12 orbital fortresses that had not been seriously tested in 400 years. The fortresses were massive, each one roughly the size of a small city, bristling with weapons arrays and shield generators that drew power from dedicated fusion plants. The Valith had fought wars, but they had fought them far from home, against species that could not reach their core systems. Their force projection capability was designed to operate at distance to subjugate or punish or coerce species that could not strike back at the heart. The fortresses were monuments to a threat model that assumed no one would ever have the logistics, the will, or the reason to bring a fight to Ashkarath. Earth had the logistics, Earth had the will, and the Valith had provided the reason. Kale pulled up the Gallomark's tactical database and ran a query on the Valith Concordance's order of battle. The data was comprehensive. Terran intelligence had been cataloging Valith military assets for decades. The numbers confirmed what the targeting package implied. The Valith maintained approximately 1,100 combat vessels across their federation, supported by 47 major installations, 12 orbital fortresses at Ashkarath, and a network of 230 minor stations that provided logistics, sensor coverage, and communications relay. The entire structure was designed to project power outward, not defend inward. It was an imperial architecture, built for coercion, optimized for fighting species that could not fight back. Iron Meridian would take every piece of it apart in a single operation. At hour 2 and 30 minutes, the Gallowmark received a fleet-wide intelligence summary from CENTCOM. The summary confirmed that Valith civilian media was carrying no reports of the Voss operation. The gassing of 14 colonies had not been mentioned in a single public broadcast. The Valith government had not informed its own population. 300,000 people had been killed, and the Valith public did not know it had happened, because it was not, in the judgment of the High Chamber, important enough to mention. At hour 3, Tanaka picked up something new on the Valith spectrum, a routine administrative broadcast from the High Chamber to all Concordance military assets, a scheduling update, training exercises for the following quarter, personnel rotation notices, a budget allocation for fortress maintenance. The Valith were planning their next fiscal quarter. 3 hours after gassing 14 colonies, they were filing budget requests. Kale stared at the intercept for 15 seconds. Then she forwarded it to every ship in Strike Group Hale without comment. She wanted her captains to see it. She wanted them to understand the depth of the indifference they were traveling 11 hours to answer. At hour 4, the intelligence feed updated with a priority flag. Valith military communications still showed no increase in alert status, no mobilization, no repositioning of defense assets. The Valith High Chamber was not in emergency session. The flotilla that had deployed the nerve agent had returned to its home berth and filed a post-operation review noting satisfactory performance with a recommendation for commendation for the dispersal crews. A commendation for killing 300,000 civilians. The paperwork was indistinguishable from a favorable job performance review. The Valith did not know Iron Meridian was coming. They did not know because they had not imagined it. The gassing of the Voss colonies was, in their strategic calculus, a minor administrative action, the removal of unauthorized settlements from a heritage zone. They expected diplomatic protests, perhaps economic sanctions, a sternly worded resolution from the Terran Assembly that they would acknowledge and file and ignore. They did not expect 8,400 warships, because the scale of their contempt for human life was matched only by the scale of their failure to understand what that contempt would cost. At hour 5, Strike Group 22 reported it had identified a Valith border patrol that had stumbled across its transit corridor. The patrol consisted of 3 light corvettes. Strike Group 22 contained 400 warships. The corvette's sensors registered the transit signatures, attempted to query them through standard Valith challenge protocols, received no response, and began broadcasting an alert. The alert went out at the speed of light. It would reach Ashkarath in approximately 9 hours. By then, Strike Group Hale would already be in the system. The corvettes attempted to shadow Strike Group 22. They lasted 6 minutes before the Strike Group's picket line disabled their engines and communications arrays with minimum force precision shots that left their hulls intact and their crews alive. The crews would be recovered later, if the Valith still had a navy capable of recovering anything. At hour 5 and 30 minutes, Kale walked the Gallowmark. She did not announce the tour. She simply left the bridge in Harsk's hands and moved through the ship, deck by deck, section by section. She walked through the weapons bays where the ordnance crews were performing final loading checks on the kinetic penetrators, each round the size of a human torso, each one precision machine to defeat exactly the kind of shielding the Valith fortresses used. She walked through the marine deck where 300 armored infantry sat in their deployment racks, silent, helmets on, weapons checked, waiting for a ground deployment that Iron Meridian's doctrine might or might not require. She walked through engineering, where the reactor technicians monitored the power output that was feeding every system on the ship at levels that would have triggered safety alerts in peacetime. She walked through the mess hall where off-duty crew sat at tables and did not eat, staring at trays of food they had drawn from the dispensers out of habit and could not bring themselves to touch. Nobody asked her questions. Nobody needed to. She was walking the ship because a commander walks the ship before battle, and the ship understood that, and the understanding was enough. She returned to the bridge at hour 5 and 55 minutes. At hour 6, Kale ate a meal she did not taste. She sat in her quarters with a tray of protein rations and stared at the bulkhead and thought about Colony 7. She had visited Colony 7 once, 3 years ago, during a routine patrol rotation. The colony administrator had been a woman named Dara Osai, who had shown Kale the experimental grain hybrids they were developing, strains engineered to thrive in the vast expanse's mineral-rich soil. Os had been proud of the work. The quiet, stubborn pride that comes from making something grow where nothing grew before. She had walked Kale through the processing facility, explained the irrigation network, introduced her to the lead agronomist, a man named Patel who spoke about soil chemistry the way other people spoke about their children. Kale remembered the grain fields stretching to the horizon under the lavender sky. She remembered Osai's daughter, maybe 7 years old, running between the rows with a retriever that was too big for her. The dog had ears that flopped when it ran. The girl had been laughing. The nerve agent would have reached the grain fields first. The atmospheric dispersal pattern suggested it was released from high altitude, settling like rain. Invisible rain that smelled like nothing and killed everything it touched. The grain would have absorbed it. Soil would have absorbed it. The water table would have absorbed it. And the people, the 300,000 people who had built their lives in the vast expanse, because Earth needed food and they needed purpose, would have breathed it in and felt their nervous systems disconnect from their bodies one synapse at a time. Motor control first, then autonomic function, then consciousness. The medical literature estimated the process took between 4 and 11 minutes depending on concentration and body mass. Children would have gone faster. Kale finished her meal. She returned to the bridge. She did not speak about Colony 7. At hour 6 and 15 minutes, a fleet-wide update arrived from CENTCOM. The Forensic Analysis Division had completed a preliminary assessment of the Valith nerve agent's composition. The compound was not new. It was a variant of an atmospheric denial agent the Valith had developed 4 centuries ago for use against a species called the Morin, a civilization that had once occupied 3 systems on the Concordance's trailing border. The Morin had resisted Valith territorial claims. The Valith had responded by deploying the atmospheric agent across all 3 Morin homeworlds. The Morin were now extinct. Their systems were listed in Valith records as reclaimed heritage zones. The implication was plain. The Valith had done this before. The gassing of the vast colonies was not an anomaly or an escalation. It was a standard operating procedure, a tool the Concordance had used before against a species that no longer existed, applied now against humanity with the same bureaucratic indifference. The Morin had not been able to answer. Earth could. At hour 6 and 30 minutes, Kale received a private communication from Captain Yunjai Park of the 10 Resolute, the second-ranking officer in Strike Group Hale. Park's message was brief. Commander, I grew up on Colony 11. My parents retired there. My brother ran the irrigation station at the Eastern Basin. I want you to know this does not affect my judgment or my performance. It affects my certainty. Kale read the message. She did not respond. There was nothing she could say that would improve on what Park had already said. She noted Park's ship in the tactical display. The Resolute was holding formation at the strike group's starboard flank, its reactor output steady, its weapons charged. Park's certainty was not a problem. It was a resource. At hour 7, A second intelligence update arrived. This one changed the tactical picture. Valeth internal communications indicated that the Border Patrol's fragmented alert had reached a regional military command on the Concordance's spinward perimeter. The regional commander had attempted to contact the patrol for clarification, received no response, and escalated the matter to Ashkarath through standard channels, filing it as a possible sensor anomaly or navigational incursion by an unknown commercial vessel. The report was logged, assigned a tracking number, and placed in a queue for review at the next morning's briefing session. It would never reach that session. Strike Group Hale would reach Ashkarath 4 hours before the briefing was scheduled to begin. At hour 7:45, Tanaka intercepted a second regional alert. A Valeth logistics hub on the anti-spinward border had detected anomalous gravimetric readings consistent with multiple large formations in transit. The hub commander filed a report suggesting the readings might indicate a natural phenomenon, a gravitational echo from a nearby pulsar. He did not suggest it might be warships because the number of contacts his sensors had registered exceeded the total military tonnage of every species the Valeth had ever encountered combined. The reading must be an error, his report concluded. No civilization possessed that many warships. He was wrong. At hour 8, Strike Group Hale linked its tactical networks. 200 warships synchronized their sensor arrays, their fire control systems, their shield harmonics. The data flowed through the Gallowmark's Combat Information Center like a living pulse, and Kale watched it on the holographic display above her command chair. Each ship's status appeared as a blue icon: weapons charged, shields at full capacity, magazines loaded. 200 ships, each one crewed by people who had read the same intercepts she had read, and who understood what surface clearance verification positive meant. Vesson approached the command chair. All batteries report ready, Commander. Targeting packages confirmed and loaded. Firing plan Meridian 7 is programmed and synchronized across the strike group. Time to objective: 2 hours 11 minutes. Acknowledged. Vesson hesitated. Commander, the crew has been reading the intercepts, the dispersal commendations, the budget requests. I know. They want you to know that they understand the mission. Kale looked at her weapons officer. Vesson was not an emotional person. She was a ballistics specialist who had once described a successful weapons test as adequate, and considered that high praise. The fact that she had come to the command chair to relay a message from the crew told Kale everything she needed to know about the temperature aboard the Gallowmark. Tell them to stay sharp. We do this by the book. At hour 8:30, the intercept feed delivered one final piece of intelligence that Kale committed to memory. A Valeth diplomatic message, routed through a civilian channel, from the Concordance's Foreign Affairs Bureau to the Terran diplomatic mission on neutral station Kasserine. The message was a formal notice that the Valeth Concordance had completed the ecological remediation of the Voss Expanse, and expected the Terran Assembly to acknowledge the Heritage Zone designation within 30 standard days. The notice included a paragraph offering the Terran government access to the Valeth cultural archives related to the Voss region, as a gesture of goodwill. They were offering Earth access to archaeological records as compensation for the murder of 300,000 people. The diplomatic message had been composed and transmitted while 42 strike groups containing 8,400 warships were less than 2 hours from their objectives. Kale saved the intercept. She would include it in the after-action report. Future historians would need to understand the depth of the miscalculation, not the military miscalculation, which was merely catastrophic, but the moral one, which was total. The Valeth had not failed to predict Earth's response because their intelligence was poor. They had failed because their intelligence could not process the concept that a civilization might consider 300,000 farmers worth this much anger. At hour 8:45, Strike Group Hale began its final approach deceleration. The gas giant's gravitational signature filled the sensor feeds, and the targeting computers began their terminal calculations, refining the firing solutions that would be used in less than 90 minutes. On the bridge of every ship in the formation, weapons officers performed their final checks, and captains reviewed their assigned sectors one last time, and no one spoke louder than necessary. At hour 9, the first combat reports arrived from the outer perimeter strikes. Strike Groups 1 through 15 had hit Valith military installations on the Federation's spinward border. The reports were clinical: Valith defense stations destroyed, fleet anchorages neutralized, ammunition depots detonated, shipyard complexes reduced to debris fields, sensor networks collapsed across entire sectors. The Valith ships that scrambled to meet them lasted minutes. Not because the ships were poorly built or the crews incompetent, but because the weight of fire that Earth's warships could deliver exceeded anything the Valith had designed their defenses to withstand. Their tactical doctrine assumed engagements with peer forces, 1-to-1, 2-to-1 at worst. They had not modeled 20-to-1. They had not modeled the kind of war where the enemy brings so much force that defense becomes a mathematical impossibility, where the engagement is not a battle, but a controlled demolition performed by professionals who have practiced every step 1,000 times. Strike Group 9 reported the destruction of the Valith largest shipyard complex, a facility that had been building warships for 3 centuries. The facility had been defended by 80 vessels and 4 weapons platforms. Strike Group 9 contained 500 warships. The engagement lasted 9 minutes. Strike Group 14 reported the neutralization of the Valith's primary munitions reserve, located inside a hollowed-out asteroid and protected by layered shielding the Valith considered impregnable. Strike Group 14's concentrated fire stripped the shielding in 22 seconds and detonated the reserve's contents from safe distance. The resulting explosion was visible from 3 systems away. Cale read the reports and felt nothing that resembled satisfaction. This was not satisfaction. This was procedure. Each report was a checkbox on a list. Each destroyed installation a line item in a ledger of capability being erased. At hour 9:30, the Valith finally woke up. The cascade of attacks across their borders had generated enough alarm signals to override the bureaucratic queuing system that had been absorbing warnings for hours. The Valith High Chamber convened an emergency session. Military commanders across the Concordance began transmitting frantic queries, demanding situational reports, ordering mobilizations that had no ships left to mobilize. Tanaka fed the intercepted traffic to Cale's display. She read it in real time. The confusion was total. The Valith had no framework for what was happening. Their military doctrine, refined over centuries of unchallenged supremacy, did not contain a scenario in which every major installation was attacked simultaneously. They did not have a word for what Iron Meridian was doing to them. The closest analog in their strategic vocabulary was a term that translated roughly as celestial foreclosure, a theoretical event in which a civilization's military infrastructure was wholly dismantled by an overwhelming force. The term appeared in their Strategic Academy textbooks as an example of something that could not happen in reality. It was happening. At hour 10, Strike Group Hale dropped out of transit at the edge of the Ashkarath system. The gas giant filled the forward viewport, banded in copper and gold, its 17 moons arrayed against the velvet of space. The Valith defense fleet was exactly where intelligence had predicted, anchored around the orbital fortresses in a formation that had not changed in decades. 600 ships. They were beginning to mobilize. Cale's sensors showed the first stirrings of movement, engines warming, shield generators cycling up, communications traffic spiking. The emergency session in the High Chamber had reached Ashkarath's military command, and someone was trying to organize a response. They were too late by approximately 11 hours. Cale studied the formation for 11 seconds. 600 ships in a defensive posture designed to repel a raiding force, not a war fleet. The fortresses were oriented outward, weapons arcs optimized for engagements at range, shield generators calibrated for kinetic impacts from small to medium combatants. They were not calibrated for 200 warships arriving simultaneously from multiple vectors, with coordinated fire plans refined over years of modeling against this exact configuration. All ships strike Group Hail, Cale transmitted. Execute firing plan Meridian 7. Commence on my mark. She paused for 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, the Valeth sensor network finally registered the 200 human warships at the edge of their system. Cale watched their formations begin to shift, watched the first frantic repositioning orders scroll across the intercepted feed. Someone on a fortress station had just seen 200 contacts where there should have been none. Mark. 200 warships fired. The first salvo targeted the orbital fortresses, the spine of Ashkarath's defense, the anchor points that provided sensor data, shield coordination, communications relay, and resupply. Remove the fortresses and the fleet became individual ships without coordination or logistics. The salvo hit 12 fortresses simultaneously. Shields rated to withstand bombardment from a force 3 times their number, struck by a force 33 times their number. The shields failed in 4 seconds. Hull breaches began at second 5. By second 9, 3 fortresses were breaking apart, structural members glowing white where kinetic rounds had converted hull plating into plasma. By second 20, 7 were gone. The remaining 5 staggered under sustained fire, their weapons arrays firing blindly as targeting systems lost coherence. The Valeth fleet moved. Cale gave them credit for that. They did not freeze. 600 ships moved into engagement formations with discipline that spoke to centuries of military tradition, and they opened fire with weapons that were, objectively, sophisticated and lethal. The human ships absorbed the fire. Their shields held. The Valeth weapons were designed to defeat shields built around certain assumptions about the maximum output a warship could sustain. Those assumptions were wrong. Earth had built warships for this scenario for longer than the Valeth knew Earth had a navy, and the ships that bore down on Ashkarath's defenders were engineered from the keel up to survive exactly this kind of fight. Strike Group advanced to secondary positions, weapons free on all military targets. Civilian infrastructure is excluded from the engagement zone. Confirm exclusion zones loaded. Every ship confirmed. The exclusion zone's orbital habitats, civilian stations, atmospheric processors, civilian communication relays were marked in amber on every tactical display. The Valeth had gassed farming colonies without making that distinction. Earth's response would be total in military terms and surgical in civilian terms, not because the Valeth deserved the courtesy, but because Earth's forces were not the Valeth. The distinction was the point. The distinction was the difference between pest control and justice. The engagement unfolded with the precision of a controlled demolition. Human warships advanced in coordinated waves, each wave engaging a section of the Valeth formation while the others repositioned. The Valeth captains fought hard. They adapted formations. They attempted flanking maneuvers, coordinated volleys, even ramming approaches when their weapons proved ineffective. A Valeth destroyer captain managed to shelter in the shield shadow of a damaged fortress and use its remaining weapons to augment his own fire. A corvette squadron executed a near-perfect torpedo run against the Gallowmark's port flank. Cale respected the professionalism. She did not let it change the outcome. The torpedo run was intercepted by the Gallowmark's point defense grid at 400 meters. The destroyer captain's shelter collapsed when the fortress behind him gave way. At minute 19, the Valeth flagship, a heavy cruiser designated ascending patience in the Valeth registry, attempted to rally the surviving ships into a concentrated defensive sphere around Ashkarath Prime. It was a sound tactical decision. If the Valith fleet could consolidate around the moon, they could use its mass as a shield anchor and force the human ships to engage from a limited number of approach vectors. The Ascending Patience's captain clearly understood that the battle was lost in open space and was trying to convert it into a siege. Kale recognized the maneuver within seconds. She pulled 2 squadrons from the engagement line and sent them ahead at maximum thrust to occupy the orbital positions the Valith were trying to reach. The squadrons arrived 11 seconds before the first Valith ships could complete the consolidation. The defensive sphere collapsed before it formed. The remaining Valith ships, denied their fallback position, scattered into individual engagements where the weight of numbers made the outcome inevitable. At minute 31, the Ascending Patience itself took a direct hit to its reactor section. The cruiser did not explode. Its captain managed to execute an emergency shutdown and vent the reactor chamber before the containment failed. The ship went dark, drifting without power, its crew alive but unable to fight. Kale marked it as neutralized and moved on. At minute 38, the last organized Valith formation, a squadron of 8 destroyers that had been defending a civilian orbital habitat on the system's outer edge, transmitted a surrender signal. They had stayed in the fight longer than any other unit, not because they had any hope of winning, but because they were protecting a civilian station. Kale noted the detail. She ordered their surrender accepted and the civilian station confirmed as untouched. Those 8 captains had done what the High Chamber had not. They had made a distinction between military and civilian. They had fought for the right reason, even if the war itself had been started for the wrong one. At minute 41, the Valith Defense Network's automated systems attempted one final gambit. The remaining fortress computers, operating without crew oversight, activated a series of autonomous weapons platforms that had been dormant in the debris fields. The platforms were old technology, unmanned kinetic batteries, designed to fire on anything that moved through their engagement zones. They powered up and began targeting the nearest human ships indiscriminately. Vessin identified the threat within 4 seconds. Commander, autonomous platforms activating in sectors 7 through 12. 15 contacts. They're firing on everything, including Valith escape pods. Take them out, all of them. Priority on the ones targeting escape pods. The Gallomark's secondary batteries eliminated the platforms in 11 seconds. The last one was destroyed by the 10 Resolute Captain Park's ship, which had maneuvered to intercept a platform that was tracking a cluster of Valith escape pods drifting near the wreckage of the Ascending Patience. Park's weapons officer put a single precision round through the platform's reactor core, and the thing went dark. Kale made a note in the combat log. Human ships had destroyed Valith automated weapons to protect Valith escape pods. She wondered if the High Chamber would understand the significance of that detail. She doubted it, but she logged it anyway. The battle for Ashkarath lasted 47 minutes. 47 minutes from the first salvo to the last Valith warship going dark. 600 ships, 12 orbital fortresses. The home system's entire military capability, reduced to cooling debris fields orbiting a gas giant whose bands of copper and gold continued to turn, as though nothing had changed. 4 fortresses survived long enough to signal surrender. Kale accepted their surrenders, secured their crews, and moved the strike group into cleared orbital space above Ashkarath Prime. Below her, on the moon's surface, the Valith High Chamber was in its emergency session. They had convened 11 hours after ordering the gassing of 14 human colonies, not because they considered the gassing a crisis, but because 200 human warships had just dismantled their home fleet in less time than it took to hold a vote. The communications request came at hour 12. A direct hail from the High Chamber to the Gallomark. Formal diplomatic protocol, the language the Valith used for treaty negotiations between equals. Kale accepted the hail. A Valith face appeared on her display, long and angular, with the bone-ridged brow and recessed eyes that made every Valith expression look like it was being observed from behind a fortification. Arbitress Yavin, the senior presiding officer of the High Chamber. "Commander," Yavin said. Her translator rendered the word with a precision that could not hide the strain underneath. "The High Chamber is prepared to discuss terms for a cessation of hostilities." Kale looked at the Valith arbitress. She thought about what to say. She thought about the diplomatic protocols she had been trained in, the frameworks for negotiated settlements that filled entire databases in Earth's Foreign Service archives. Then she thought about Dara Osai's daughter, running through the grain fields with a dog that was too big for her. "There are no terms," Kale said. "Commander, I must. You deployed a persistent nerve agent against 14 agricultural colonies containing 300,000 civilians. Your military reported the operation as surface clearance. Your High Chamber was not in emergency session. Your defense fleet was not mobilized. Your officers filed commendation requests for the dispersal crews and submitted maintenance work orders in the same transmission that confirmed 300,000 deaths. You treated the killing of 300,000 people as a routine administrative action, and then you filed your quarterly budget." Yavin's expression did not change. The bone ridges above her eyes shifted a fraction of a degree. "The vast expanse is a designated heritage. 300,000 people are dead. Farmers, teachers, children. You killed them because they were growing wheat in a place you hadn't visited in 600 years, and you killed them with a weapon that will make the soil toxic for a millennium. There are no terms. There is no negotiation. There is no framework in which you offer something and we accept it and the people who died stay dead, but we all agree to move forward. Then what do you want?" The question was genuine. Kale could hear it, the first crack in the composure that had allowed Yavin to preside over a government that classified mass murder as maintenance. The arbitress genuinely did not understand what Earth wanted, because she had never encountered a response that was not transactional. In the Valith's experience, every grievance had a price. Every atrocity could be settled with territorial concessions, or resource transfers, or symbolic gestures that cost nothing and meant less. "I want you to understand what happened," Kale said, "so I will tell you. At 2:47 this morning, I reported the chemical attack to Earth Central Command. At 3:04, 17 minutes later, CENTCOM activated Iron Meridian. At 3:06, 8,400 warships received targeting packages. At this moment, every Valith military installation outside this system has been neutralized. Every fleet anchorage, every ammunition depot, every forward operating base, every sensor station, every shipyard, every dry dock. Your navy no longer exists as a functional entity. The fleet you stationed here was your last organized military force, and it lasted 47 minutes. Yavin said nothing. Behind her, Kale could see other Valith figures in the High Chamber, their angular faces turned toward displays that showed the same information Kale was reciting. "Iron Meridian is not a negotiating position," Kale continued. "It is the elimination of your military capacity to repeat what you did in the vast expanse. When it is complete, your civilian government will remain intact. Your civilian infrastructure will remain intact. Your people will not be harmed, but you will never again possess the means to gas a colony or burn a settlement or clear a surface or do anything to any human population anywhere for any reason. That is not a term. That is a fact. You are dismantling our sovereignty. You dismantled the lives of 300,000 people in 9 hours. We are dismantling your ability to do it again. The difference is that your people will survive ours." The channel remained open. Kale did not close it. She let the arbitress sit with the same silence that had filled the open channel from Colony 7, when 300,000 people stopped answering. Yavin reached for something. Kale saw the movement on the display, the Arbitress's long fingers extending toward a control surface outside the frame. For a moment, Kale thought she was going to cut the channel. Instead, the view widened. Yavin had expanded the transmission to show the full high chamber. Dozens of Valeth officials sat in tiered rows of carved stone seating, their angular faces uniformly still, their recessed eyes fixed on displays that showed the wreckage of their navy drifting against the copper bands of the gas giant. None of them spoke. None of them moved. They sat in the same silence that had filled Colony 7's open channel, and for the first time in 400 years, they understood what that silence felt like from the inside. Kale held the channel open for another 30 seconds. Then she closed it. Reports continued flowing in over the next hours. Strike groups across Valeth space reporting identical results, military targets neutralized, civilian zones untouched. The Valeth military, which had projected power across 11 species worth of territory for centuries, ceased to exist as a strategic entity in 14 hours. 14 hours for 14 colonies. Kale noted the symmetry. She did not know if someone at CENTCOM had designed it. She did not ask. At hour 15, the last Valeth military asset, a deep space listening post on the coreward edge of their territory, crewed by 12 technicians who had spent hours watching their civilization's military infrastructure disappear from their monitoring boards one icon at a time, confirmed its surrender to Strike Group 39. Iron Meridian was complete. 8,400 warships had engaged and neutralized every military element of the Valeth Concordance without a single strike against civilian targets, without a single demand for surrender before the operation was underway, and without a single dead human combatant. The Valeth had lost their entire navy, their orbital defenses, their forward bases, their logistics network, their manufacturing capability, and their capacity to project force beyond their own atmosphere. They had lost it in the time it took to grow a crop of wheat. Kale remained on station above Ashkarath Prime for 3 more days while the diplomatic corps arrived to begin the post-war framework. She did not participate in the diplomacy. She had said everything she had to say to Arbitress Yavin, and the words had not been diplomatic. They had been precise. On the first day, the other species of the Valeth Federation began transmitting. 11 species had lived under Valeth administration, some for centuries, bound by treaties and obligations that the Concordance's military had enforced. With that military gone, the treaties meant nothing, and the species that had lived under Valeth authority for generations began, one by one, to withdraw. The transmissions were not hostile. They were not celebratory. They were careful, measured statements of disengagement from a power structure that no longer had the ability to enforce compliance. By the end of the first day, 6 of the 11 species had formally declared their independence. By the end of the second, all 11 had. The Valeth Concordance, which had administered a federation spanning a significant portion of the local cluster, was now a single species occupying a single system with no military, no federation, and no capacity to compel anyone to do anything. The administrative indifference that had allowed them to gas 14 colonies had been the same indifference with which they had governed 11 species, and those 11 species had noticed, and they were leaving. On the second day, the first forensic teams reached the Voss expanse. Their reports were worse than the telemetry had suggested. The nerve agent had been more persistent than initial models predicted. The colonies were not just dead. They were poisoned at a molecular level, the soil saturated, the water systems contaminated, the very air carrying trace compounds that would remain lethal for decades without active remediation. The forensic teams wore full environmental suits and still limited their exposure to 4-hour rotations. They found the colonists where they had fallen, in the grain fields where the harvesters stood idle with their engines still running, in the processing facilities where the conveyor belts carried nothing to empty bins, in the schools where the morning's lesson plans were still displayed on screens that no one would read. In the medical clinics, where the doctors had tried to treat the first symptoms before they understood what they were treating. In the residential quarters, where parents had tried to seal the doors and windows against something that had already been inside the air they were breathing. Colony 4's greenhouse complex contained 412 bodies. The greenhouse had been sealed, its own air filtration system had delayed the agent's penetration by approximately 40 minutes. The workers inside had known something was wrong. They had watched through the glass walls as their colleagues in the open field stopped moving. They had sealed the doors. They had called for help on communicators that connected to networks where nobody answered. And then the agent had found its way through the filtration membranes, because the system was designed to filter agricultural particulates, not military-grade nerve compounds, and the workers had died knowing that the sealed doors had bought them nothing but time to understand what was killing them. Dara Os was found in the command center of Colony 7. She had been at her console when the agent reached the building's ventilation system. The forensic report noted that she had been composing an emergency transmission. The message was incomplete. It read, "All colonies under ATM." The transmission had cut off because Osai's hands had stopped working. The nerve agent targeted motor neurons first. She would have been conscious for several minutes after she could no longer move, aware of what was happening, unable to do anything about it. The report noted that her daughter was found in the adjacent room, in a reading nook built from reclaimed shipping crates. The child had been holding a book. The retriever was beside her. Kale read the forensic report once. She filed it. She did not read it again. There were some things that did not become easier with repetition, and the image of a 7-year-old girl holding a book while invisible poison settled over her was one of them. On the third day, CENTCOM transmitted the final Iron Meridian status report. All objectives achieved. The Valith Concordance's military capability permanently degraded. A monitoring framework to be established to prevent rearmament. Reparations to be discussed in the diplomatic phase. The Voss Expanse designated a memorial zone. A memorial zone. 300,000 people reduced to a line in a status report, a zone on a map, a place where nothing would grow for 1,000 years because an ancient civilization had decided that human farmers were a nuisance. The report also noted that 23 Valith military personnel had been killed during Iron Meridian crew members on vessels that had been destroyed before they could evacuate. 23 dead against 300,000. The ratio was not justice. Justice was not possible. What was possible was the certainty that it would never happen again, and that certainty had been purchased in 47 minutes at Ashkarath and 14 hours across the Concordance. On the third day, Captain Park sent Kale a second message. It was shorter than the first. It said, "The irrigation station at the Eastern Basin was automated. My brother would have been in the control room when the agent hit. The room had a window facing the fields. He would have seen the grain die first." Kale read the message. She filed it with the forensic reports and the intercepts and the targeting packages and all the other documents that would form the permanent record of what the Valith had done and what Earth had done in return. The record would be thorough. It would be precise. And it would stand as long as the memorial zone stood, which was to say, for 1,000 years at minimum, until the last molecule of VX analog 7 had broken down in the soil of a place that had once fed millions and now fed nothing. Commander Kale stood on the bridge of the Gallowmark and looked out at Ashkarath Prime through the forward viewport. The moon hung in the light of the gas giant, its cities visible as a fine tracery of illumination across the surface. Those cities were intact. Those people were alive. The Valith civilians who had gone about their daily lives while their government gassed 300,000 humans were eating meals and reading to their children and sleeping in their beds. And they would continue to do so because Earth's response, for all its totality, had been aimed at the machinery of violence and not at the people who lived under it. That was the line. The Valith had made no such distinction. They had killed everyone in the vast expanse, every farmer and teacher and child and dog, because the presence of those people in that place was, to the Valith, a category error to be corrected. Earth had corrected the Valith's capacity for correction. That was all. That was everything. Her executive officer, Commander Wren, approached the command chair as the diplomatic shuttles began their descent toward the moon's surface. "Commander, the relief rotation is inbound. We're cleared to stand down from station keeping in 6 hours." Kale nodded. "Orders for the crew." She considered. There were things she could say, words about duty, about the weight of what they had done, but her crew had read the same forensic reports. They had seen the images from Colony 7, from Colony 12, from all 14 stations where human beings had died choking on air that smelled like nothing. They did not need her to tell them what they had done or why. "Standard rotation," Kale said. "Rest when you can. We'll be home in 9 days." Wren left. Kale remained at her station. Below her, the Valith were beginning to understand what it meant to live in a galaxy where the people you gassed could answer with 8,400 warships in 14 hours. They had spent centuries as the largest military power in their region of space, and they had used that power the way unchallenged powers always do, without imagination, without restraint, and without the slightest consideration that the people on the receiving end might answer. Earth had answered. The answer had taken 14 hours, and the Valith would spend the rest of their civilization remembering that those 14 hours erased everything they had built their security upon, because they had spent 9 hours killing farmers and expected the universe to look the other way. The universe did not look the other way. The Gallowmark held its position above Ashkarath Prime. The gas giant turned, and Commander Kale sat in her chair, watched the cold light of distant stars and did not flinch, and did not look away, and did not regret.